Welcome to everyone. I know some of you are quite familiar with Tavaana, others are new to Tavaana. A warm welcome to each and every one of you. We are very lucky to have here today Rebecca MacKinnon, author of Consent of the Networked, one of the world's leading thinkers on the internet, and we're here to launch the Persian translation of her book, Consent of the Networked, which has been groundbreaking in terms of its analysis and comprehensive scope of the problems that activists, including people like yourself, face in repressive regimes like Iran. Also here with me today is Colin Anderson, one of the people in this whole world who knows the most about the internet situation in Iran, and he has been tracking and analyzing developments there in terms of the regime's surveillance and controls on the internet, especially on a very regular basis. Also with us today is Nima Rashedan, who needs no introduction for most of you. He is one of Iran's most accomplished analysts on the internet, and as you know, he has been a teacher, a professor at Tavaana. Since the beginning, he has taught our introductory and advanced digital safety courses. Before we begin, I wanted to say more about Rebecca MacKinnon. We are really so honored to have her and to have a Persian translation of her book available to anyone and everyone through Tavaana, and again, are grateful to you for that permission. Rebecca MacKinnon is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, which is a Washington-based think tank. She is fluent in Mandarin Chinese and deeply knowledgeable about the problems of activists in repressive regimes like China, but also Iran and around the world. She is a founder of Global Voices, a citizen media network. She was a fellow at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, is on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and was for 12 years a journalist, including as CNN's bureau chief in Tokyo and Beijing. So we will begin by some questions that I have prepared for Rebecca, and then some questions from both Colin and Nima. And then, of course, we are very, very much looking forward to your questions and your ideas and your concerns, which you can share with us via Twitter. And you can send those to us in either Persian or English. So let me begin by asking you, Rebecca, and let me move over the laptop here for you. Let me ask you about the title of your book, Consent of the Networked. Why this title?
Well, Consent of the Networked is a play on consent of the governed, and the idea that governance should take place with the consent of those who are being governed. That's kind of the fundamental idea of democracy, is that people are granting their consent to have government. And one of the kind of premises of this, because this book is really about human rights and the internet, and it's about freedom, but it's in the context of freedom within the context of democracy and human rights, which does not actually mean free for all. Anybody out there can do anything they want under any circumstance, because total freedom in political theory is what Thomas Hobbes, a political theorist, called the state of nature, right? In which life is really only good for the people who are the strongest and most powerful, largely men, and everybody else who is a child or a woman or not strong in some way kind of loses out in such a way. So this is why we have governments, right? To ensure that the rights of all are protected, to ensure that there's a structure to society. There's a reason why we want to have government. And these kind of basic core principles apply, not only in physical space, but apply to the internet, just as we want to have rights to freedom of expression, rights to privacy from, intrusive surveillance on the internet. In order to have rights protected, you actually need some governance. It's not just about everything is completely free under all circumstances, because if everything's completely free under all circumstances, then criminals get to do whatever they want. And you only get to punish the criminals if you personally are stronger than them, which is not a good situation to be in. So the point is that we do actually need some governance and some accountability mechanisms in the digital space, just as they exist in the physical space. But if there's going to be governance, it needs to be based on consent of the governed and not just imposed by whoever happens to be the most powerful or by whoever got there first. So that's really the premise, and I know that this is perhaps a slightly longer answer than you expected, but I think it's important because in the discourse between democracy activists, human rights activists who talk about internet freedom and why it's important, the response from some authoritarian regimes, one often hears this response, particularly from China, but I think you hear it from a lot of other regimes. So, what do you mean internet freedom? We can't just let anybody do whatever they want on the internet. Then it'll be full of porn and criminals and all kinds of things that parents don't want. You want your children to be able to do anything they want on the internet? Of course not. If you have children, you can't be for internet freedom. If you're for decency, if you have religious values, you can't be for internet freedom. That's sort of the authoritarian response to the internet freedom argument. And this book is in part a response that, that is a false dichotomy. Of course, it's not a place where there are no protocols, no rules, no standards of behavior. It's just that the governance that takes place needs to happen on the basis of the consent of all of us netizens, all of us who inhabit the internet. And the other part of that is that, of course, the internet is not just a nation-by-nation thing. Some governments, of course, don't just have an internet in their own country and have it disconnected from the rest of the world, but nobody's quite succeeded in that except for North Korea, but we put that aside. The internet is a globally interconnected thing, right? And so when you talk about governing the internet or establishing kind of common norms and practices and rules, it's not just about, okay, this government makes these rules and that government makes that rule. It won't work that way ultimately, just because of the nature of the technology. And then the other complication is that you have these companies that are very powerful. Google, which we're using today for our Hangout, its decisions about how the network is shaped, what you can do, how can your identity be known to others on their services, all these things, these affect your physical rights. It affects all kinds of things in relationships. And so they are performing a kind of governance. And so my argument is that anybody who's exercising power over my digital life, over your digital life, over everybody on this Hangout on their digital life, needs to be held accountable. And that if they're going to govern us in these various ways, they need our consent. And so we're kind of part of a global community that's figuring this out.
And we'll keep the camera on you. One of the biggest challenges I felt that you had while I was reading your book and enjoyed it so much and felt that it was just so useful for people in Iran and Iranians around the world really concerned about the freedom in Iran, not just internet freedom in Iran, but freedom, broadly speaking, in Iran. One of the biggest challenges I felt you had is that you're talking about the whole internet and the whole world in your book. So what's the difference? What are the big fundamental differences between internet freedom in a place like Iran and internet freedom in a place like the United States?
So there are obviously quite a lot of differences. One has to do with the fact, I think the fundamental difference is that you can't say that there are no abuses happening in the United States, but we can talk about them. We can have debates about them, and there's a way to change them. There's more mechanisms that if we don't like what the U.S. government is doing in terms of surveillance practices, in terms of You can get it through. So that's a big difference, is that when abuse happens, it's possible to report about it, and you can report about it and you can criticize it without going to jail. You know, so not that there aren't problems, but it's a much more open process. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, people often don't know what's really happening. You know, they know abuses are happening, but you can't really get to the bottom of why. You can't have a robust public discussion about what the solutions are, and you can't put pressure on your politicians if you don't like what they're doing in the same way. So for instance, you know, I spent a lot of time studying China and Chinese internet censorship, which a lot of governments, including the Iranian government, are trying to emulate in different ways. And sometimes the Chinese government, when you criticize their internet censorship, they'll say, everybody censors. You know, the Germans censor Nazi speech, and the French censor hate speech, and, you know, so what do you mean? You know, we all have the right to censor the way we want to censor. But there's a difference, and the big difference is, and this speaks exactly to your question of what's the difference. In Germany, they have a very narrow number of things that are allowed to be censored. And that decision was made by a parliament that was elected by the people, and it reflects, again, the consent of the governed. And if the people don't like the fact that certain speech is being censored, they can get their elected representatives to change that, so that there's an accountability around what is being censored. Now, of course, even in democracies, there's some debates about whether that power gets abused, and so we put that aside because it's within a pretty narrow range of content. But with China, you know, they have these laws that say, oh, the government can ban any speech that is against the national interest, basically. And so, and the people, these laws were not passed with the consent of the people. There was no public debate about the content and scope of these laws. They were put in place by the party that claims to be acting in the people's interest, but there was no process to determine what kind of censorship, if any, the Chinese people really want. Right. And so it's just there. And that's the fundamental difference at the end of the day.
All right. Let's move to activists and civil societies in places like Iran. What, as far as the internet affords, what has been most useful to them, and what has been most detrimental to them as far as the internet goes?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, you know, and just to qualify, I'm not an expert on Iran. In fact, Colin and yourself are much greater experts on Iran than I am. But clearly, the ability to connect to the outside world. I mean, I think we saw with the Green Movement, people's ability to get the story out, even though the foreign press was kept out of Iran, the world knew what was happening on the streets, thanks to the internet. And that was that's extremely important, right? You know, and so this ability to, you're not having to rely on professionals and whether professionals have access in terms of whether you get on the world media radar screen. Is very important. It's key. Okay. And so that's, and in terms of the downside, you know, I mean, again, it's the downside is more complicated, you know, and it's more about, you know, just because you have the technology doesn't magically mean all your problems are going to be solved, you know, and just because that, you know, and I think we're seeing a pattern in a lot of authoritarian countries where in the beginning, the activists kind of have the upper hand because they discover the technology first, and then the government is playing catch up. But some governments are catching up, and then it becomes a more sort of even playing field, or sort of an arms race in terms of who has the most technology. And so ultimately, I think we're finding, in a range of countries, let's say, you take two countries that had different experiences with the Arab Spring. You have Egypt and Tunisia. In both cases, the internet played a major factor in overthrowing two different governments. However, what has happened since then has been very different. And the reason why Tunisia is having a much more successful process of democratization, and why Egypt is a mess, doesn't have very much to do with the internet. It has to do with a lot of other issues related to political dynamics on the ground, how much sectarianism is at play, all kinds of on-the-ground issues. And so one of the things that I heard from Egyptian activists sort of about a year after Mubarak was overthrown is that they kind of engaged in self-criticism where they said, we were really great at using the internet to get to that point where Mubarak stepped down. We were completely unprepared for what happened next. We had no goals, we had no strategy, and we hadn't made the on-the-ground political alliances, that are less to do with the internet and more to do with just old-fashioned strategy, politics. We hadn't done that work. So we were irrelevant in the election that followed.
So you think that the technology, Facebook especially, is kind of irrelevant when it comes to the building of democracy and democratic institutions. It's instrumental for the mobilization and people power and civic association, civic expression. But when it comes to you need to have a good constitution. You need to have an independent judiciary. You need to develop political parties in a transparent and an inclusive way. You don't see that the internet is actually helping with that.
Well, I wouldn't call it irrelevant, but it's just one of many factors in the mix. Right. And the fact that the internet is there doesn't change the level of importance of all the other things. Now, the fact that the internet exists can be very helpful, let's say, in your constitution building process. I think, Tunisians' pro-democracy movement has been good at using the internet to get people to participate in the constitution building process and to ensure that there was a much broader kind of engagement in that process. But nonetheless, there were many other factors about that process that were not technology related and more related to institutions. And so similarly, in elections, in politics, the fact that you can have people doing election monitoring with their cell phones, and that's meaningful. So technology plays a meaningful role in all these things, but just put the technology there and not have all these other processes in place. It can be a really, it's kind of like cooking, right? So you still need all the ingredients. You still need to whip the cream, but the internet provides, I don't know, you can call it the oil or the spice or, there are things that it does that makes what you're doing, if you use it strategically, much more effective. But you still need an overall recipe. You still need, these ingredients that are kind of more sort of timeless.
Okay, this is kind of related, and also related to your earlier point about how it's a race. It's a race between the regimes, the repressive regimes, and the people, the civil societies, the movements, if they exist. Evgeny Morozov says that it's wrong to think that the internet is just there for the oppressed, it's just there for the citizen journalists or the activists. It's there for everybody, and it's there as much for the oppressors as it is for the oppressed. That, in fact, it can be a very useful tool for fascists and nationalists and racists and religious radicals and the governments that espouse those ideologies. So he's saying we need to be careful about our expectations about liberation technology. I wanted to ask you about this because in Iran it's proving very much true that the regime is able to make effective strategic use of the internet, particularly Facebook, and also old-fashioned media, to promote itself. Recently, I mean, the Supreme Leader has a Facebook account and tweets and all of that, but more recently, Jawad Zarif's Facebook page has been cause for a lot of attention. How do you see Facebook in particular? Do you see it as a terrain that replicates civil society, or does it try to be civil society for some countries like Iran, and it kind of fails to deliver?
Yeah, well, I mean, to speak to Morozov, I mean, he's right. The internet is used by everyone, and we're seeing all kinds of people, some Democrats, some, you know, real fascists, some extremists, some criminals who are making good use of Facebook to, you know, just every kind of person, making use of the internet generally. And it, you know, with Facebook is complicated because they have created a very certain kind of environment. And they have certain rules about what you can and cannot do there, and about your identity. They have a real name requirement. So, you know, it's enforced in a really uneven way, but at the end of the day, if you can't prove you are who you say you are, they can delete your account at any time. And you lose your rights in Facebook, you know, and those rules were not made with our consent particularly, they just are there. And so for activists, that can be problematic, because for some activists and some politicians, you know, it's great that you are who you are, and, you know, people can't create parody accounts of you without getting taken down. But then there are others who really, you know, want to be able to use a pseudonym, who want to be more secure in how they're communicating, but still want to participate in the public discourse. And Facebook disadvantages those people. So the extent to which the public sphere is in Facebook, it advantages certain types of people who feel they have nothing to hide, or are able to have much better ability to control what information about them is and is not public. And it disadvantages people who might have good reasons not to reveal their full identity. So that's part of the, you know, one of the several issues with Facebook.
Okay, sticking with problems for particularly active people in repressive regimes and how internet technologies can be detrimental to them. Moving on to surveillance. We've seen that in Syria, in Iran, in many places now, the surveillance technology that is being used by the repressive regime is purchased actually from a company that is located in a democratic country. You and others have done some very groundbreaking work, really, in trying to control these corporations and have them at least voluntarily agree to some codes of conduct and some accountability. In general, how is this going? Do you see it progressing? Do you see that the obstacles are mounting by the day, or do you think that there's a true sense of responsibility emerging among these corporations? I mean, Nokia Siemens is just one example that happened during the Green Movement. There seem to be countless.
Yeah. So, you know, there's lots of different kinds of corporations. Depending on what category of corporation we're talking about, I would be more or less optimistic. And so they're the corporations that make the equipment of the kind that you're talking about, Nokia Siemens, who are providing equipment for networks that is then used to assist with surveillance. Other more specific software and device-making companies like Blue Coat and so on, that Narus, you know, that are creating technologies that are also assisting regimes with surveillance. Those companies, we have not been very successful in accepting human rights responsibilities. Okay. None of them have joined the Global Network Initiative, which is an organization I founded to try and get companies to commit to principles. I think for those kinds of companies, you know, Colin Anderson here, who will be joining the conversation in a moment, has been very much involved with kind of tracking what those companies are doing and contributing to kind of improving legislation around controlling what they do and identifying what they do, and so on. I think where we've seen the most progress is actually with the other category of companies that are providing services for communication. So the Global Network Initiative, which is an organization that we created some core principles for free expression and privacy that companies should adhere to, and some guidelines for how the companies can implement these principles. And particularly around government requests for either to censor content or to hand over user data. And the companies that have joined so far are Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook. WebSense did join, so that's one kind of interesting company on the edge. And then there's a couple of smaller companies that most people haven't heard of. And there's been a real challenge getting other large companies to join. So far, there's some telecommunications companies that have sort of affiliated themselves with the Global Network Initiative and are probably going to start doing more transparency reporting. But it's not clear whether they're going to join. But that group of companies, when you're looking at sort of the internet platforms and the telecommunications companies, they seem to understand much more clearly that if they want users, if they want to be commercially successful, they have to make some commitments about free expression and privacy. And at the very least, they have to be more honest about what is their relationship with the governments that are demanding data on surveillance. You know, so Google is publishing what they call a transparency report, where they're issuing statistics from all over the world about how many requests they're getting from different governments and what percentage they respond to, and you know, a number of other companies. You know, Facebook has started to do this in a more limited way. A number of other companies, Twitter and so on, are doing this, and this is good that they're doing it. We need to make sure that they're following this up with some other practices and policies, but it's a step forward, and it's a step forward in terms of making commitments that they're not going to willy-nilly just do anything a government asks, you know, just to, you know, get a few extra, you know, a little extra access or something. And so for those kinds of companies, I think we are seeing some progress. You know, Vodafone, which operates around the Middle East, and many, I don't think they're in Iran, but they're in a lot of other places, just announced this morning that they are going to, in June, start to report on the requests they receive from law enforcement in 25 countries where they operate, and what their process is for responding to those requests. And I think that really helps citizens understand what's going on. So I think there is progress on that. But when it comes to those companies that are selling, you know, what we call deep packet inspection technology to governments, those are kind of like the arms dealers.
Yeah.
You know, and the arms dealers are much harder to control because arms dealers don't have an incentive to respect human rights. Because their whole business model is around selling basically evil technology, and they just make money off of it. And so for those people, you need a much bigger stick to just kind of whack them with. To get them to stop. So that's a harder
as far as
process.
legislation in free countries, say the United States, you don't see anything coming down the lines like from Congress saying, you know, you companies cannot sell to places like Iran and China. You don't see that kind of legislation coming.
Well, we already have a lot of export controls and sanctions around Iran. Where that's going to go in the future with relationship is hard to say. There's not many restrictions on China these days. I mean, it's much more limited because China is such a huge trading partner. So, you know, there's a piece of legislation called the Global Online Freedom Act, which has been kind of in Congress in various draft forms for almost a decade now. If I had to bet money, you know, I would not bet money on it passing anytime soon. But the proposal is more around kind of accountability and transparency at this point. But it's hard. And the other problem is identifying the specific technologies, because there are a lot of technologies which they can be used for really bad things, but they're also really essential for civil society. And so this is part of the problem with existing export controls, actually, and sanctions, which is that because of some of the existing sanctions and export controls, people in Iran can't access some basic web tools and they can't purchase some basic software that civil society actually needs, basic kind of consumer equipment. And that's harmful to civil society. So it's very hard to devise the law in a way that's finely tuned enough. It's not impossible, but it just takes it takes a lot of smart people doing it, sitting down and doing it properly, rather than kind of very quickly throwing a law together.
Okay. Before I hand over to Nima and Colin, I want to ask one more question, which I think I'd be very remiss in not asking. It's front and center on everybody's minds in Iran and the people outside of Iran who are concerned about freedom in Iran, and that's filtering, restricting access to the internet through a number of ways, including decreasing the bandwidth and the speed of the internet, or in places like Egypt, even shutting it off entirely, which has not happened really in Iran. How do you see this moving forward? Do you see any magic that there will be piecemeal solutions only for the foreseeable future? We had the internet in a suitcase thing that really, how do you see it all?
Well, you know, it's interesting, since you raised the internet and the suitcase thing. You know, I know the people working on that pretty well. And, you know, there's no technology that's a magic bullet. What internet in the suitcase is really not a thing in a suitcase. It's a kind of basically a suite of software that you can put on various devices and then set up a wireless mesh network that's independent of your ISP, and kind of, you know, mesh your cell phones together and so on. And that's still in development, and I wouldn't completely count it out as completely dead yet. It's just that technology takes a long time to develop. It's not like, okay, you know, we're going to just put this in place in a year and then everybody's going to use it. You know, making something that's really usable on the ground, that's not going to kind of create more problems than it solves.
Circumvention
tools,
but
circumvention tools generally, you know, they're being used by, you know, a certain percentage of internet users in various countries. Different circumvention tools are created by different groups for different purposes. Some people use them. You know, there are various trade-offs. You know, some circumvention tools, like Tor, for instance, you know, is very robust in that, you know, your information is kept secure. The people running Tor can't see your communications. But on the other hand, it's slower, whereas there's other tools that are faster, but you have to trust the people operating it with your information. And so there are all kinds of different trade-offs you have to make. And, you know, that when it comes, I mean, we need circumvention tools. Circumvention tools are a necessary part of this whole landscape. But I think we're sort of hitting a bit of a wall in terms of beyond a certain number of people in any given country. It's just really hard to expand the use of circumvention tools beyond a certain level.
Okay.
And we found that in China. We found that in a lot of different countries where, like, beyond a certain community, it's just really hard to get adoption rates beyond, you know, whatever percent it happens to be, and it's at different levels in different places. So, you know, and there's a lot of reasons for that, you know, Colin is very familiar with. But governments, again, you know, it's part of this arms race. They're also improving what they block. They're, as you mentioned, not just filtering, but they're, you know, they're corroding the bandwidth. They're making it harder to just, you know, they're not blocking things, but, you know, it's just much harder for certain kinds of to use certain kinds of services. That's much harder to deal with. Again, it kind of comes down to, if we're just going to approach this as an arms race, you know, it's really hard to say who's going to win here. And so the extent to which we can think about, you know, sort of some broader interventions around, I mean, ultimately, if you're, you know, I hate to say, if the government, you know, if the political system is unaccountable and the system for governing the technology, and if the companies are unethical, it's this, you know, this kind of state of just this arms race is tough. I mean, yeah. Ultimately, you kind of have to hit the problem at a higher source, which is much harder.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Let's switch to Nima. Nima, are you ready for some thoughts, questions, concerns for Rebecca?
Yes. I guess good afternoon, everyone. There, it's evening in here. So yeah, you know, before I just begin with what I wanted to my comment, you guys have my voice? Is it like all right? I think, you know, and I'm trying to be very honest and very frank about, you know, what I think. I had time, you know, to make up my mind about what happened since for last, you know, 5 years. Particularly, there was this amazing and unprecedented scale, you know, like 5 million people came out in Iran. This is the number. The number itself is not, you know, comparable with anywhere else. I don't know. At least I'm not aware of any sort of political gathering, non-violent, non-religious, of just, you know, 5 million people, peaceful people coming to the street and ask for their rights. But you know, apart from what I'm doing with internet and internet freedom in Iran, which has a very long history from very early days of internet in Iran, I was among first users. In parallel to that, I did part of my professional, you know, personal life is about communist regime in Central Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, and I see a problem here. You know, I'm trying to be very, you know, like direct. I see a problem there. You know, you remember opposition people in Poland, dissidents, very few number of people, and we are talking about Soviet Union with 45,000 nuclear warheads with 11 hours of time difference. A huge thing in the verge of, you know, victory. We had a clear idea about how to deal with that. We stood for our values. We sent our, you know, people, intelligence community there with the typewriters. We helped those people, and the situation was far more difficult than a country like Iran or other countries censoring internet. And it worked. In 1976, 19 dissidents, they came out in Moscow to including Andrei Sakharov and others, to protest. We helped them, and such a, you know, the President of the United States called them evil empire. Very, you know, direct, without any hesitation. So, you know, we helped those people and it worked. So the problem of those 5 million Iranian people waiting in Freedom Square, Azadi Square, Shahid Square in Tehran, and asking for outside world at least listen to them. It's very clear. Why don't you do the same thing with us? I think a part of the bigger problem, which outside world, including, you know, foreign actors, have problem to understand us, is that we are not clear enough to say what we stand for. If and I'm really sorry if it goes a bit different direction, but how can you really explain for a population that if I can ignore A dictator in Syria killing 200,000 of his people, gassing little children, and I can somehow deal with that. How can I protest as a normative power, as an ideal power who stands for some basic values that, okay, Iranian government is doing filtering on WeChat. So I think by ignoring what's happening in Syria, we gave them blank check to do whatever they want to do. That's the essential question. That's the main question. And I'm really sorry if it's a bit, you know, non-related to this lack, this hesitation of taking leadership. This, you know, I don't know how to explain, you know, those people who came to Tehran, and they were not people who were, you know, enjoying the rights we have in Occupy Wall Street. They were getting shot, bare hand, stood for their values. They refused to repeat, to say anything against the United States. They stood for their values. They say no Gaza, no Lebanon. They were talking to the world. On what way on earth we help them? I'm really sorry. It's very unfortunate for me to say we did nothing. We did absolutely nothing.
Okay, Nima.
Right.
Talking about technology and the internet specifically, what could we have done? What could free countries have done in order to help the green movement?
But it's a, you know better than me, it's a very complex situation. When our official position is, and it's been said on public microphone, that for us, Mr. Mousavi and Ahmadinejad are the same people. That's something which has been said. So do you really expect the Iranian government not to go after all those, you know, activists? There is a case you guys all know. His name is Sattar Beheshti. He's a worker, he's a laborer. It's a guy who's not, you know, earning a lot. He was going on day work, non-skilled work, and he was coming to his computer just to write some comments. All what he did was posting some comment on volunteering. That I'm against, you know, dictatorship. The very same day, the very same hours that Sattar Beheshti, an Iranian blogger, was torturing and was dying under the torture, European Union delegation was exchanging Iranian official cookies in the city of Isfahan.
Okay.
So how do you really expect those population to trust you anymore? We shall stand for our normative values. We can't leave people alone like that.
Okay, Nima, thank you. We're going to switch over to Colin and get some, I would hope some more targeted thoughts and questions regarding people's lack of access to the internet, the problems they face when they do access the internet, and if you can focus more on the internet freedom situation of Iranians. We have a number of excellent questions from our audience, so I definitely want to have time for those. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. It's an honor and privilege to be here. So if I can, so if I can clarify two things and then shift the focus to Iran. One thing that I wanted to clarify, in fact, was that within the struggle between corporate interests and international human rights accountability, I think that there has been a growing recognition that there is a responsibility for especially Western governments to intervene or at least play some accountability role. And so in fact you have seen the rise of some legal structures for export controls having to do with these sorts of equipment. The newest thing, and this is all very like within the past couple of weeks, is that there's an international export controls agreement between 40 states, European and Western states. And this traditionally dealt with dual-use items having to do with military capacity. And in fact, what you see is the shift of this into a human rights regime just as much as it is a military export control regime. Included on this list is it has things to do with malware for compromising computers and for DPI equipment. And so you are seeing internationally stronger controls, or at least the beginnings of stronger controls on the export. And that's constructive. And I think that the more that we strategically understand the role of the state versus the role of corporations and how to interact with both, the more that we're able to, as civil society, exert our independence and our connection to reality on the ground. So that's my one international side. To go specifically into the context of Iran, and then I'll probably, if you don't mind, push it back as a question to Rebecca.
Wonderful.
You know, ultimately, circumvention tools and filtering are hacks on the network. You are doing something that the network administrators, especially the telecommunications companies of Iran, strategically do not do. That is always going to be a struggle. Filtering and getting around filtering is always going to be a struggle, and it's especially going to be one of the most partisan struggles that exist within Iran. You are going to run up not against the political establishment, but the cultural establishment. Why was WeChat blocked in Iran? It wasn't about communications or mobilization. It was about the friend finder app and the social norms that was breaking. And so a lot of these are running up not into just the concern of the regime as far as stability, political stability, but also social stability. And obviously that's a consequence of the fact that you have a state that decides both political and social realities. But this is to say that, but by focusing your interventions and focusing internet freedom specifically on filtering, you're missing a substantial portion of the picture. You know, just I sort of as an aside started writing down a list of things that aren't filtering that matter just as much as filtering.
That are not filtering. That have nothing to do with filtering. Okay, tell us.
And so in Iran, it has to do with, for example, bandwidth to consumers. There is, for something like 8 years now, been a Majlis imposed limit on the bandwidth speed. And obviously, you can get around it by forging papers or paying off the right guy. Iran is Iran, right? But you still have a state of affairs where Iran's bandwidth is, you know, the sort of average bandwidth for the average Iranian is less than all of its neighbors, Tajikistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, even. And so that is a product of not filtering policy, and it's also very contentiously debated. You also have just simply cost. And why is internet in Iran cost money? It costs far much more than its neighbors. Again, the problem is that you have a monopoly on the private industry. And so if privatization and anti-corruption was a part of Rouhani's reform agenda, then the telecommunications company of Iran has to be at the forefront. Because the telecommunications company of Iran, by all measures, seems to buy bandwidth at $10 and sell it for $100. The markup is ridiculous, and that's what prices people out. Yeah. And because this monopoly is about control, but it's also counterintuitive to a modern economy.
Sure.
And you again see conversations not on filtering. You see conversations about deregulating the TCI, or not deregulating the TCI, but removing the monopoly of the TCI. You have issues like wireless spectrum licensing. These get into really nuanced things that no malicious bureaucrat would understand. But there is for next generation wireless networks, there is a monopoly by sheer virtue of the licensing regime for MobiNet. So WiMAX is, they have the only license for national 4G service. So again, this is in that bidding process, as we see with the MTN Iran cell lawsuit, is entirely corrupt. And so if I think that's so at a time in which Bayezid is going and saying we're buying more bandwidth, we're going to increase the bandwidth, and people aren't seeing this translate in terms of like ubiquitous, inexpensive access. This is the contention, and it's not over filtering. It's about economics. It's about social and economic development and entrepreneurship, and how you deal with the fact that something like 70% of the population is under 30. And so when you don't talk about things that directly interface with the social regulatory, regime and political regulatory regime of the state, then I think that you reconceptualize internet freedom as something that's achievable, but matters just as much, right? If you have faster bandwidth, then all of a sudden Tor being slow is a lot less of a problem. You know, if you're...
So you're saying that the people in Iran want faster bandwidth.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, yeah, you're saying that
Even
they don't have faster bandwidth because what? What's the reason they don't have faster bandwidth?
Sure.
So it's a combination, right, of the politics, of course, but you're saying that even if the Iranian government wanted people to have faster bandwidth, it couldn't happen overnight? Are you saying that?
They could deregulate it.
Yeah. So
they could eliminate the monopoly.
Right, exactly. So this is a simple regulatory structure. It's not, you know, what they were saying up until a year ago was the bandwidth is slow because there are cyber attacks, because there are Stuxnet, because of sanctions, because of these other things. You actually now have one of the fastest cables running between Germany and Iran and Oman that was just lit up within the past like 6 months. The Iranian, the telecommunications company of Iran is selling that to Kurdistan and Afghanistan. It's not using it domestically. It is using it to generate a profit. And so this is nothing more than corporate malfeasance that is aided by governmental corruption, but also just a lack of government action.
But they don't want the people to have the fast bandwidth.
I think
and they're probably profiting from it too,
exactly.
right? It's a big
they're making money.
It's corruption. It's what they call rent seeking.
Yeah, sure. they're making money, but I would say much more importantly, they don't want people to be online freely.
So they have their cake and they eat it too. They make money and they keep people off the internet.
Right? I think that's true, but I think that that sort of mindset runs up against is whatever private industry exists. And you do see a debate. You see a debate within the trade press.
But the government of Iran owns that private industry.
Sure, but that private industry...
It's not private, in other words.
Well, but that private industry, you know, why was VPN eventually unblocked? It was because it was messing with the banking system.
Let's get Nima in here because I think I'm sure Nima has something to say.
Right. No. I just want to add a few words. Just names for general public, you know, because I think Iranian, they know that. But if for non-Farsi speaking, for people who are not dealing with the Iranian situation, like inside Iran net, when you hear WiMAX, what does it mean WiMAX? So at first place, it means like kind of technology to deliver some sort of, you know, data communication to the users. But when you go behind WiMAX, the company who is in charge of WiMAX, Mobinnet and Zaim, they belong to Intelligence Ministry. Pars Online belong to Revolutionary Guard. You know, each Datek, Shuttle, each of these ISP providers are either, you know, current Guard, Revolutionary Guard commanders or people who were working. Interesting thing about WiMAX is actually WiMAX is part of the Intelligence Ministry infrastructure for their, you know, local whatever they do with internet. And they have extra bandwidth capacity they are selling to people for God knows what reason, for tracking activists or whatever. So there are people, and I know some of them, they were working inside this infrastructure and they escaped after 2009. They are living in Europe and they're ready, you know, they went public and said what is exactly happening inside Shuttle, inside Pars Online, inside Datek. So when we are talking about Iranian ISP and infrastructure, we should bear in mind this is something completely state-owned. There were people, by the way, pre-2000 protests, there were people who, one of them I happen to know, he came to Dubai, he had talked to US representative, you know, table in Dubai. Thanks to WikiLeaks, that talk went public. They did not give, he wanted 9 million toman from the government. They did not give his money and he had to escape, you know. So there were people involved before 2009 that we can call them, right, some sort of private sector. But after 2009, I wouldn't call one of those guys real private sectors. The communication, the telephone, the cell phone industry is far too more sensitive that can be trusted.
Okay, go ahead, Collin.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Right.
So, I mean, here's the debate. The debate, I think, between you and Nima is that you're saying that we are so focused on what the government is saying and doing with regards to the internet, particularly filtering, that we're missing a whole host of other issues that impact people's experience of the internet. But I think the pushback on your point is that, but the things that you're pointing to, particularly these companies and the fact that they have access to this high-speed internet, but instead of providing it to their own population, they're providing a very low-quality, low-bandwidth internet to Iranians at a very marked-up price, but they're still able, because of their power, to sell it to other people. So they're providing the high speed to other places and providing the worst at a very high rate to Iranians. How, besides the political, besides the politics, how would you explain that?
Well, I would say that we don't, this isn't a real division in an argument, because we know, for example, that the telecommunications company Iran is owned by a consortium, and MTN as well, are owned by consortiums of which either the Bunyads or the IRGC directly participated. That isn't to say that these are benevolent actors. That is to say twofold. One, they still want to turn a profit, but also that this is a debate that clearly exists within society. And you can identify it in the statements that Bayezid makes on a regular basis, having to do with raising the bandwidth cap. You can even see it sort of in the transition time. There was a time in which everyone was trying to pretend, because they saw the cards, all of the old Ahmadinejad people were trying to pretend that all of a sudden they were much more enlightened than they actually were. What they did is they said, we tried to raise the bandwidth cap. We're trying to do this. And what I'm trying to say is that while the actors might not be well-meaning, they have interests, and those interests often don't necessarily directly run up against the security state, not directly. And they have interests that can be utilized, and there are conversations that I think can exist within society much more readily than some of the things that...
Can you give an example?
Well, I think, for example, having broader access to, rural access to the internet as an economic and social development platform. That is something that serves an internet freedom agenda. It was actually a part of the Fifth Development Plan. And so there's an alignment between the economic development interests of the state.
But that seems to be happening anyway. There seems to be a lot of rural access to the internet.
Sure, but what I'm saying is internet freedom is not always confrontational to the state. And so having access was both something which was within the government policy, but also within the interests of internet freedom itself.
Would you agree that maybe the reason that the Iranian government allows the level of access that it does is that the country as a whole, including the regime itself, has become highly dependent on the internet?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is the interest, maybe. This is the leading interest for why there is this level of penetration.
Exactly. And so this is what I mean by saying that they might not be benevolent actors. They might not have the best interests or democratization in mind, but they have certain things in mind. They have certain structural dependence, where they have international economic business relations, where they don't want to chase out private industry that is bringing in foreign money. And so where these things align, I think that these are conversations that we should not move because we're interested specifically on the matter of Facebook or WeChat.
Yeah. We have a number of questions, and I know, Nima, you probably want to say a lot because I want to say a lot. I always disagree with Colin, but I like him so much. We have a number of questions from the audience, and the issue, though, is that these questions, a lot of them, have to do with digital safety issues and internet access issues, and I'm glad Nima's here because in his classes and on Tavaana Tech, you can get answers to these questions. If you don't have time to take a class, if you don't even really care to go on Tavaana Tech or the Facebook page of Tavaana and Tavaana Tech, You can download the digital safety manual that Nima has prepared, and I can honestly say that the answers to all your questions are in that manual. Nima, of course, has always been very generous with his time to people, students of Tavaana, but generally his fellow Iranians. So we are here, we're at your service, but we're not going to take the time here today to answer technical questions. I think everyone hopefully can understand that. There is a question, a good one, for Rebecca, and we have not yet talked about this. We should talk about it. Iran, the Iranian regime, like the Chinese regime, is aspiring to have a national internet. Internet halal, internet milli, and they, of course, haven't done it yet, and they've been talking about it a long time. So in some ways, it's dubious, even if this is going to happen. But if it is going to happen, what are your thoughts, and what are any cautions that you might make to the Iranian people?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It might be a little late for Iran, frankly. You know, the Chinese internet, the big difference between the Chinese internet and the Iranian sort of aspiration to create more of a domestic internet is that from the very beginning, when the internet, when people first started, when the internet first became commercially available in China, the government was thinking quite strategically about, we need this for commerce because we want to be a global economic power. We need communications, but we need to have it on our terms. And so they were thinking about this from the very beginning. So, you know, at the very start, they were filtering certain content. And of course, it was a lot less sophisticated than it is now. But they also, from the very beginning, encouraged the development of local companies to set up Chinese internet companies, to obtain international investment for those companies. So that very early on, you had e-commerce, you know, Alibaba, you had a company called Tencent, which is WeChat, you know, which is now providing WeChat all around the world. You had these companies that got going in the late 90s, early 2000s. The Chinese government, you know, again, this is kind of a regulatory thing as well, that the banking system, that, you know, it was possible actually for Chinese entrepreneurs to set up internet companies, you know, so that they had enough foresight to allow local internet businesses to develop. Of course, China's not under sanction, so these entrepreneurs could get investment from Silicon Valley and Wall Street and Hong Kong and everywhere else. That certainly helped. But then, you know, you skip over a number of years, and then what happens is you have Baidu, massive search engine, that actually for a Chinese user, if you want to know about Chinese cultural things, it's more useful to you than Google because it's run by Chinese people. You know, they're all, you know, there's a Chinese clone of Facebook, there's Chinese versions of YouTube. You know, so for people who are not very political, who aren't very connected to the outside world, if they don't visit any foreign websites, they've kind of got everything they need. There's like no dependency. A lot of the internet activity that's happening in China now among a lot of ordinary people is not dependent on access to external services. It's kind of, there's enough, but the reason why it's developed is because the Chinese government allowed enough commercial investment and competition to happen. But they also control it, right? So they block Facebook, they block YouTube, they make it really hard for Western companies to function in China. And if you're going to do business in China as an internet company, you have to play by their rules. You have to censor in the way they want you to censor, and if you don't do that, and if you don't comply with their surveillance requirements, you can't do business there. So they've created an environment that's, you know, largely on their terms, but they did it early enough before Chinese users got hooked on all these international services. They had lots of Chinese email services before Gmail even existed.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And so, you know, in Iran now, so many people are so dependent on Facebook and, you know, and the Iranian diaspora and, you know, so on.
And the Iranian regime.
You know, and the regime, you know, the Chinese government, nobody from the Chinese government's on Facebook except the diplomats talking to foreigners. Chinese government doesn't care about Twitter. They don't need Twitter to talk to their people. They have Weibo. You know, they're using Chinese services to talk to their people. They don't rely on any foreign services to govern their own people, to communicate with their own public. So Iran is sort of, in a way, too late. Perhaps. I mean, again, I never count anybody out because, you know, a lot of people will assume that the Chinese government wouldn't succeed to the extent that it has, and they did. So, you know, never say never. But Iran is in a different situation.
All right. Quickly on the issue of internet, internet milli, internet halal, Colin.
Yeah. So I think that when it was presented the first time, it was, like you said, presented as a magic silver bullet, when it isn't. What it is it's essentially just a local communications network. At the end of the day, if you don't have any connection outside of the country, then you're stuck with whatever the government's providing you. The internet in the suitcase doesn't provide that. And so you can have a mesh network, and you can have a connection outside, but if you're using Muharat or you're using whatever, that, you know, Shatel, you're still stuck with that. And so the problem is that we still have these dependencies on linkages to the outside that don't exist right now. And so there might be times in the future in which, you know, mesh networking is useful for connecting a village with each other and having communications and maybe having copies of Wikipedia locally. But because we don't have a really economical means of connecting that mesh network outside, satellite internet is very, very expensive. It's like $6 a megabyte. So as soon as your YouTube video is going to end up costing you $300, right? And so until we start to figure out how to deal with states that control the central infrastructure, until that problem is solved, no mesh network is going to really solve it. If you're in a protest situation and you want to talk to people really quickly, or you want to, you know, build something within your community, it's helpful for that. But we're still sort of held hostage to the malign designs of truck design.
What do you think about internet milli, the idea of the Iranian government creating a national internet? Do you think they are going to be able to do it, and if they do, what implications does it have?
So I think the framing moment for me right now, I mean, we have to be clear that it does not seem like it's disconnecting.
Okay.
What it is it's coercing people to use local services or making better services. There was a cyber defense expo in December where they had all of these products, and these are the national defense, cyber defense products, and one of them was an antivirus called Hadid. I played with it yesterday, and I realized that it's produced by a Turkish company. It's a Turkish antivirus that they've just put
Nima is laughing. He likes that.
But it tends to be this. If you look at the national email services, they're open source clients. If you look at all of the, except for the Tavaana one, every service that I have seen is Western produced open source software that they've put they've probably gotten $100,000 in order to develop this. But is at the end of the day nothing new. And so if they keep failing in that, then you know, these aren't competition for Facebook. And so if they keep failing in that regard, then they have no chance.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to more questions from our audience. Unless, Nima, John, do you want to say something about the whole debate around national internet? Hold on.
There.
Can you unmute and speak about the internet milli?
All right. Yeah. No. I just want to one sentence on comparing China and Iran about filtering. You know, we are talking about two completely different things. If I was honestly, if I was a Chinese Communist Party official, I would be heavily offended with notion of comparing my filtering program with Iranian one. You shut down Chinese internet, the whole world economy collapsed. So what happens if you shut down Iranian internet entirely? They did it in June 2009. Nothing happened. Nothing, absolutely nothing on world scale happened. Nothing even in Iranian scale happened. Iranian economy is not dependent on internet anyway. So China, we're talking about a country which has double-digit growth and has huge investment. And I think it has little to do with sanctions. I think it has to do with the Chinese vision of economy. So there you have rulers who want to have this economic growth, and here you have rulers who want to sell their oil and invest that oil revenue in Hezbollah and Hamas. So these are two different things. I don't think Iranian government gives a lot of thought about internet, whether internet is going, it's going to cause huge catastrophe if they shut it down. They are completely ready to shut it down in the case of any sort of mass demonstration. And I think what they are trying to do is quite obvious. They are trying to maintain their national internet, have dependency on their data server, on their sort of hosting things. And one of the reasons they do that is to have free hand to shut down the internet, the real internet, the free internet, timing of their wish. So in the other words, they are going to offer people two kinds of internet. One is very fast, is going to be very fast, and I really disagree. If the bandwidth limitation in Iran is sole political decision. Iranian parliament since 13 years ago put a legislation that you have to keep bandwidth to 128 gig, which is now changing, but anyway, we can discuss that for obvious reasons. If they let people to have fast internet, they are going to watch TVs, they are going to do things that it's not allowed in Iran. So this is some sort of artificial bandwidth limitation on users. So they are going to give users this halal internet with a very speedy, fast sort of bandwidth, probably pretty much cheaper than the real internet, so that the user kind of consumption behavior change, that they say, okay, good, like I would love to go to Facebook, but anyway, this is cheaper, easier. I would go to FaceNama or this whole alternative side. The good point that Colin raised was that they were injecting money, millions of dollars of money, to make alternatives to Facebook, to Gmail, to even they did to the computer games, video games. But all their end product, because of corruption and because of being not effective, exactly unlike China. This is a very huge contrast to China, which is a country which, as you mentioned, produces WeChat, which I'm using, right? So the end products are so ridiculous. Those games are so good that I know a lot of people who are smoking pots and go and play for those games to purpose of laughing. It's so kind of a bizarre thing that it's just good for making joke out of that. All right.
Thank you so much, Nima. If you can mute. We have a lot of questions that are kind of very demanding, and people are kind of angry. I would summarize them with this question: why doesn't America do more to provide the internet to places like Iran and other places that are even more repressed, like North Korea? What exactly is standing in the way of a much, much more robust policy from the United States government in this regard?
Well, I don't know. I've been asking why the American government doesn't actually do more to, address inequality amongst its, the American people, or, there's a lot of things that the American government is failing to do. Not only in relation to the people of Iran and North Korea, but in relation to, in American citizens who are not receiving anything. I mean, there are many ways in which our government is failing many people, including many Americans. So you are not alone in your frustration with why the American government isn't doing enough to help insert whatever group of people we feel that should be helping. So part of it is
what has the American government done successfully, in your view, so far, and what should it be doing that it's not doing?
In general in the world, or on
internet freedom
generally?
On repressive regimes.
So I think one thing, so I guess a couple of things. The fact that the State Department a few years ago kind of came out very strong to say rights on the internet are the same as human rights extend to the internet, and that there's this internet freedom agenda that's really an extension of a human rights agenda. I think that was very important. It kind of helped to set the table. Not that they always do a great job at executing this principle, but it helped to set the table for a lot of other democracies making similar commitments that we can now kind of push them on, which also relate to supporting internet freedom in repressive regimes. And so that was very positive that they did that. They've been funding a range of tools, a range of efforts. Frankly, it's really hard to measure the success, or how you even define success. So what is the timeline of success? Is the timeline, you fund something and within 3 years you have to see XYZ result? Or is it that, in aggregate over time, some of these projects will succeed, some of them will fail, and it's going to be really hard to know what had what cause and had what effect, but somehow it's better that they did these things than not doing those things. And so I think that's kind of with a lot of the funding, it's just very hard to measure the overall global impact, let alone the impact within a particular country, because it's not just about numbers; it's about so many things. But the fact that they're doing something is good. They have a limited budget on internet freedom. I think that budget is going to probably be reduced rather than expanded, most likely, in the future. I think this relates to some of the other things that have been raised about America, because it's connected to the United States' willingness to act for human rights on a whole range of things, not just on the internet, but in Syria or etc. And how the American government and the American people define the United States' role and responsibility in the world. I mean, it's very connected, and there's not a big consensus. And Nima was talking earlier about kind of contrasting, the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of the way in which the United States stepped up in a very clear way at that time, and in contrast to what's happening now. And this does connect to the internet policy, so which is that the American people and sort of American politicians and the U.S. government generally do not agree about what our role is, or there was a lot of consensus about kind of who the enemy was back then, that you had democracy and you had communism, and there was sort of a clear dichotomy and a clear, even amongst different political parties and so on, a clear sense of what America stood for. And frankly, there's a much less clear consensus in this country about what does America stand for, and what is our national interest, and what do we want our government to do on our behalf, and do we want to give it any taxes at all, to help anybody outside of the United States. There's a lot of people who are trying to reduce taxes even more, so there'll be even less money to help people in Iran or North Korea or Syria or anything else. So, there's lack of consensus about priorities, and then even where there is consensus about we should do something about some problem, people don't agree about what the solution is or how to respond. So it does tie in, the internet freedom policy and this very specific technical responses or lack of technical responses does connect to this broader geopolitical complaint that we've been hearing. And, I think this, frankly has to do with, the United States is a different thing than it was, a few decades ago.
Yeah.
And its relationship to the rest of the world is very different. And the internet has played a role, I think, in making it more complicated. The United States government has lost a lot of credibility, in no small part, to internet activists.
What would you like to see the U.S. government or governments of other free countries do with regards to internet freedom for repressive regimes? What are some useful things they could be doing that they're not doing?
I know Colin's kind of.
You want to get in here?
You want to say something first before we respond to that?
Well, I think that internet freedom is unlike, military warfare where you can launch a bomb. You can't launch an internet freedom bomb. No. And so you're constrained by the realities of the state.
But the circumvention tools have worked.
Yeah, they have, and that's one of the limitations. There is very few things. For example, let's say that if the United States wanted to invest an infinite amount of money and park a satellite right above Iran and provide internet to Iran, they would just jam it. And so you're up against, again, these barriers in which if I could figure out a way to make the telecommunications company of Iran irrelevant, within 5 years, I would spend the entirety of my time doing so, because there would be nothing that's more impactful than the decentralization of the telecommunications market in Iran, and providing more international. There's a fundamental notion in networking that the more international gateways that you have, the harder it is to filter. Mm-hmm. And so Iran having more international gateways, again, as somebody outside, there are very few things that I can do to make that happen. I can provide research data that maybe embarrasses some of the Iranian, economic pride about the matter. Okay. But I can't, there is limited ways in which we can really do this. Okay. And we have to acknowledge those constraints.
Let's ask Nima. Nima, what would you like to see happening from the U.S. government or governments of other countries with regards to expanding internet freedom in places like Iran?
Well, I totally agree in some sense with Colin. I mean, if the guy has a button that he can shut down internet, if he has some sort of access that every single bit of information going to that country or coming out of that country somehow pass under his hand, there is probably not much thing we can do. Or, for example, a very much more simple question. These guys are doing satellite jamming. They are preventing people in cost of cancer and all that problems, health problem, in addition to all other problems to people. Preventing them are watching VOA or BBC Persian, right? So what can we do? Is there any sort of remote technology that we can prevent them of sending those signals? No. We diplomatically can we sort of going and bomb their parasite machine? No. So it's much more, going back to what Rebecca said, it's much more a political will. And I totally agree with you. If some sectors of population, they don't see necessity of investing in Iran, investing in internet freedom and Iranian liberation technology, and it's not population fault. I think it's the job. If someone get elected to lead a nation, it's his job to explain for population why do we need to help those people. Here you travel from Estonia in the northern part of former Soviet bloc to Albania to southern Serbia to Montenegro. You see economy are flourishing. Just one index like female entrepreneurship, it's exploding. There are numbers of, and I'm sure you guys, you travel in these countries, you travel to Baltic republics, you travel to Poland, Czech Republic. And you see, for that little investment we did in their freedom, they are bringing this back. This is, in any sort of calculation, is good for America, is good for European Union, is good for Western world. Let's invest to them and just compare, just for 1 second, compare problems that, for example, Polish women or Czech women, Slovak women had in comparison to Iranian women. They are being arrested on the street and they are being stoned. So if you invest in these people, the people who have no other possibility than asking you for help to access to information, to learn something, to ask and demand for their rights, you are going to win, even long term, in any sort of real political, realist school, neoliberalist, any sort of thing. You will not lose anything. You are going to win a lot. This is something.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to turn to Rebecca for just 30 seconds now. If you do a 30-second closing statement with maybe some advice for the people of Iran.
I guess I would say this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. That this is the work of the long term. And just because, in 1 year the problems don't get resolved, doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying, and that you shouldn't keep working, and that you shouldn't, we should always continue to use our creativity to reach out, to try new things, to move forward. And I think if you look, again, my father's a professor of history, so you look at the arc of human history, it's about lots of people making an effort, added together, ends up making a difference. And we can all make a difference if we make the effort. But it's not always in a straight line, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you so much, Rebecca MacKinnon, Colin Anderson, Nima, Rashedan. Thank you very much to our audience. Again, a reminder, you can download the book in Persian from the Tavaana website, from Tavaana's Facebook, Twitter, and on the Facebook event page, of course. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all.